Hi everyone, welcome to our first full week of remote learning now in May. We are starting our week off with a little introduction to different types of evidence for evolution. So we're going to be highlighting the four things that are listed here on the screen. We're going to spend some time talking about fossils today. We're going to watch a segment of a video about whale fossils too during this lecture. We're going to talk about some anatomical structures, homologous, which we've heard that word before this year. Remember homologous chromosomes, chromosomes that are the same size, shape, and they carry the same genes. The key being there, the word same, right? So we'll see what that's all about. Analogous structures and vestigial structures. You might not know what they are now, but once we start talking about them, I think you'll start to remember or you've heard of them before. Embryology, which is the study of embryos and their development. And then finally, we're going to refer back to some of our DNA stuff and talk about how DNA sequences can be used as evidence for evolution and common ancestry and relatedness. All right, so here we go. We're going to start with fossils. Fossils, of course, are a great piece of evidence for evolution because they show gradual changes in species over time, and they also show evidence for organisms that are no longer here but have left their remnants. Now, the thing with the fossil record, of course, is that it has a lot of gaps. We haven't found all the fossils, and we probably won't find all the fossils. Not all organisms will fossilize. Usually it has to be bone or an imprint. It has to be the right environmental conditions. And of course we have to find them, right? We don't know where they are located. So there's a lot of gaps in the fossil record. But the information we do have tells us a lot about organisms that are no longer here and how our current organisms that are here could be related to them. So looking at this picture here, these are some whale or ancestral whale fossils. Now, I don't know if you knew this or not about whales, but whales actually have this little bone right here in the picture. Do you know what that is? That's a pelvis. Whales have hip bones, but they don't have legs. So biologists believe that whales have evolved from land mammals. So these fossils over here on the left-hand side are some ancestral whale fossils. These are the transitional fossils that show the original ancestor of whales, or the fossils that we have found for what we believe to be the original ancestor of whales, and their transition into the water. You can see the loss of the hind limbs and just leaving the pelvis behind in these transitional fossils. You can see the shape of the head changing. You can see the body length and body shape changing, the front legs becoming fins, all these things here. So we're going to watch a segment of a video about the whale fossils. We're going to get to see the actual paleontologist that discovered all of them. He's super famous in the biology world, if you can be super famous in the biology world. He's going to take you to the spot where he found them, and you're going to get to see the actual fossils and what they look like and the transitional form. So this is a long special here. It's about an hour long. This is the link to it if you wanted to watch the whole thing. We're only going to watch a couple minutes of it together. Together but apart, right?
The Sahara Desert is one of the driest places on Earth. But 40 million years ago, things here were quite different.
This used to be the sea. Just think of this being the current Mediterranean coast of Egypt backed up about 40 million years, about 100 kilometers to the south of where it is today.
Here, in what had once been the southern Mediterranean Sea, is a 100 square mile stretch of layered sandstone with a surprising name: Valley of the Whales. The name is well suited. Scattered everywhere across this arid landscape are what look like heaps of rose-colored stones.
Here's a Basilosaurus.
But they're not stones.
You can see how big the vertebrae are. Here's the lumbar partly weathered away.
They're whale skeletons, 40 million years old.
There's another one back here coming out of the mushroom. There's one over here. And back over there's one. This whole place is full of whales.
Why were there so many whales concentrated in this one spot? Gingrich believes that Whale Valley was once a protected bay, a lagoon hidden from the open sea by underwater sandbars. Perhaps the whales birthed their young here and came here to die. But even with hundreds of whale bones at his feet, Gingrich was disappointed. Nearly all of the skeletons belonged to a whale called Basilosaurus, a 40-million-year-old creature already known to science. Basilosaurus lived full-time in the water. If whales had evolved from land mammals, they had done so long before Basilosaurus. So Gingrich didn't think the bones would be of much interest. But he couldn't have been more wrong. After only a few days of digging, he made his second amazing find. It turned out that Basilosaurus had something modern whales have long since lost.
For the first time, we've got whales that have legs.
The bones were small but unmistakable. A pelvis, a kneecap, even toes. This whale had a complete set of leg bones. Gingrich brought back as much of the skeleton as he could carry. It was dramatic evidence that whales had once been four-legged animals. Since Gingrich's finds, he and others have filled in more of this fantastic story. Scientists now think that the earliest ancestor of whales was similar to this 50-million-year-old wolf-like mammal called Synonyx. Synonyx was a predatory scavenger that lived and hunted along the shores of an ancient sea. Perhaps its descendants found the water a source of abundant food and a haven from competition. Over millions of years, front legs became fins. Rear legs disappeared. Bodies lost fur and took on their familiar streamlined shape. Since Gingrich's first find, named Pakicetus, the list of known transitional whales has grown. It now includes Ambulocetus, Rhodocetus, Durodon, as well as Basilosaurus. They reveal another element of whale evolution, the gradual migration of nostrils to the top of the head as whales adapted to breathing in the water.
How did whales lose their legs?
As the years went by, they evolved into newer types of...
Gingrich's work demonstrates what Darwin himself insisted, that the evidence for evolution is all around us if we choose to look for it. And bones aren't the only evidence of whale evolution. Their ancestry is also visible in the way they move. Frank Fish studies how today's marine mammals swim. He looks for their evolutionary heritage in the way they move through the water.
The big question is, how do you go from a terrestrial mammal that ran around on all four legs to something such as a dolphin, which now doesn't have any legs at all and is well adapted to swimming in the oceans?
Even though whales look like fish, they don't swim like them. Fish swim by flexing their spines from side to side, like the shark. But mammals swim differently. This otter swims by undulating its spine up and down, in exactly the same way that whales do. And, as it turns out, in the same way that land mammals use their spines when running. Whales took with them into the water their ancestral way of moving, and we can still see it 50 million years later.
All right, so some pretty interesting stuff about those fossils and how they found them. One of the museums in Washington, D.C., I believe it's the Museum of Natural History, one of the Smithsonian's, has a room with all of the transitional whale fossils, all their skeletons hanging from the ceiling. It's pretty neat. I've been there and looked at them all. Of course I have, right? Of course I've been there. But it's pretty neat. Those museums are all free, so maybe someday when the world starts up again, you can go there and check those out. But that's fossil evidence. So now we're going to take a quick look at embryology. So embryology is the study of embryos and their development. So here in the picture are a bunch of embryos. You once looked like this, right? What a throwback. And these are the embryos of several other organisms. So we have a rabbit, a chicken, a turtle, salamander, and a fish. Now, if you look at these organisms, in the very early stages of development, so this would be when they first are forming, they all have a very similar appearance, right? If I remove the bottom half of this picture, would you be able to tell the difference or be able to identify any discernible traits that make something a fish, salamander, turtle, chicken, rabbit, or human? Probably not, right? It's not until later in development where you start to see some of the key characteristics and features that those organisms have. For example, if you look at our embryo, we have a tail, right? But you weren't born with a tail. At some point during development, our embryos lose that hind limb tail, that little bud that we have here. And now when we're born, we don't have a tail. Some people are born with little tails, so they have to get removed, but that's pretty rare. So what does this suggest in terms of evolution? What does it all mean? Although these embryos start out looking the same and then end up with a different appearance, the fact that they start off looking very similar, there's something in their DNA or their genes that code for these particular appearances in development. So we know that everything about ourselves, everything about ourselves, all of our physical features, our anatomy, right, our physiology, like enzymes, some of our behavior, all of that is rooted in our genetic blueprint or our DNA. So there's something in the genetic blueprint of all organisms during development that says, have these things, have a tail, have gills. And then, of course, as you develop, your developmental genes code to have those things go away and other features appear. But early on in the stages of development, organisms have this very similar appearance to one another, suggesting that because there are similarities in our embryology, there is perhaps similarity in our DNA, which would suggest a common ancestor, which would suggest that we are related. Anatomy is our next one. So what you have in the picture here are what are called homologous structures. And we talked about how homologous means same or similar. So what's similar in this picture? What do you see? You see some bones, right? If you're a junior, maybe you're in Anatomy 1 and you learned the bones inside of the forelimbs here. The long bone is the humerus or your funny bone. Then you have two bones in the lower part of your arm, the radius and the ulna. Your wrist is made up of several bones, the carpals. Then you have your metacarpals in your palm, and your phalanges are your fingers. So this is the structural layout of our arm. That's hard to say. And then these are the structural layouts of the cat leg, or arm, if you will, the whale fin, and a bat wing. So if you look at these bones, there's kind of a similar layout, and they're not exactly the same, of course, but you have a similar sort of skeletal structure here. You have a large, long bone that starts it off, followed by two smaller, thinner bones next to one another, a cluster of bones, which would be like our wrists, the carpals, and then you have your metacarpals and your phalanges. So it's not exactly the same, but very similar structural layout. And what would determine how your bones are laid out? What part of your body would determine that? 3 letters, right? DNA, yes? So there is something in the DNA of these organisms that causes their skeletal structure to be the same in all of their, not the same, but very similar in all of their forelimbs. And these organisms are all what? Starts with an M. Do you know? They're mammals. So all these organisms are mammals, and we would tend to believe, right, that mammals are more closely related to one another than, say, mammals and reptiles, right? So the structural layout of all these organisms here in terms of their skeleton, their DNA coded for this similar layout. So this suggests that these organisms are related to one another. There is some sort of ancestral relationship here. And although they're similar in structure, they're different in function. So they use them for different things, but their DNA codes for them to have a similar layout. The opposite of that are analogous structures. So for analogous structures, these are structures on organisms that have the same function, but they have a different structure. So in the homologous, we saw similar structure, different function, right? Your arm is used for grasping, right? Picking things up. Cat's going to use it for walking, whale's going to use it for swimming, and a bat's going to use their wing for flying. So different functions. But in our analogous structures, we have a similar function, but a different structure. And the example here would be with a bird wing, which has hollow bones inside of it, and the wing of an insect, which doesn't have any bones, just like a membrane. So you might look at these organisms and think, well, both of those organisms fly, but in terms of their DNA, and what dictated this particular structure on their body, they're not as closely related to one another. Insects and birds, that of course, right? Because they don't have that similarity in their structure, or they have analogous structures. So they have evolved this ability to fly separately of one another, and they probably do not have a recent common ancestor, at least not as closely related or have as more recent a common ancestor as mammals would, like we saw in the picture before. Continuing on here, our last of the anatomy examples are vestigial structures. So vestigial structures are structures that an organism has that no longer serve a purpose. So they're left over from an ancestor that once had a purpose for that structure, but no longer has it. Some snakes, if you flip them over, don't try that at home, right? If you flip them over, you see these little, they call them spurs sometimes. It is believed that snakes probably evolved from something like an ancestral lizard and lost its legs, so now it just has this sleek body with no limbs. Some snakes, when you flip them over, they have the remnants or remainders of what was kind of almost like a pelvis, or where they would have had their hind legs when they evolved from a lizard-like organism. So vestigial structure is almost kind of like a fossil right on an organism. It's a piece of the past that no longer has a function on the modern version of that organism, but it suggests that that organism has evolved from a different version of itself or an ancestor in its past. So can you think of any vestigial structures on humans? Take a second to think about that. I think the first one that always comes to everybody's mind is the appendix, right? Maybe you've had your appendix taken out. Your appendix is this little organ here at the bottom of your digestive tract. It contains a lot of enzymes. They say it's helpful in harboring bacteria, to help with certain diet. They think that our ancestors would have had more of a use for the appendix based on the type of diet they had. They were eating more plant-like materials, probably raw meat. So they had this little organ here that supplied the enzymes and such to break that food down. Whereas because we now have a different diet as modern humans, we don't have a need for that appendix like our ancestors would have, which is why you can get it removed and still live without it. Another one is your tailbone. We saw in our embryos that during development you have a tail, but then you lose it before you're born. And this is the bone that's left over here for where your tail would have attached. Of course, other mammals have tails, right? We don't. We lose ours in our particular species. Goosebumps, or the muscles that cause goosebumps to happen. So that's these muscles here, the erector pili muscles. These are responsible for lifting your hairs up, and that's why if you're really cold, right, you get all those little bumps all over your skin. What do you think that is for? Any guesses? It's to keep you warm. Our ancestors probably had more hair on their body, so they would have had more of a purpose for that. By pushing the hair up, it's going to help you stay warmer. You ever seen, for example, if you have a dog, right, in the winter, their fur gets thicker. When they bark or they're upset, right, sometimes their hair will stand up on end, make them puffier, appear bigger, scarier to an opponent or something that's threatening them. Similar idea. Also for warmth, we don't really have that same need anymore because we don't have the same level of hair on our body that our ancestors would have. So that's a vestigial structure. Your wisdom teeth, you may not have these yet, depending on your age and your development. These are your teeth that are at the way back of your mouth. Sometimes they become impacted and you have to have them removed. They don't have anything to do with intelligence. It is believed that our ancestors would have used or would have had a more of a use for wisdom teeth with like plant like diets that they would have had for grinding plant like material and helping to break down that cellulose that's in the plant cell walls. You guys remember all that stuff? Whereas nowadays we don't have as much of a plant like diet, depending on what kind of food you eat, of course. But so a lot of times you either will have them removed. For example, for me, I don't even have them. They never appeared. Every x-ray I get of my teeth, they're not here. My dentist says I'm highly evolved, which I always appreciate. But so you might not get them at all. Just depends. And then one more example. There's a couple more, but we'll just leave it here. Ear muscles. So you have little muscles around your ears. If you've ever seen like a rabbit or something like a dog, if they hear something, they'll move their ear. We don't have the ability to do that. Our ears don't move anymore unless you can wiggle your ears. You're one of those people that's gifted enough to do that. I can't do that. But that ability to move your ears so you could hear a predator coming or some kind of threat, not so much a skill or something we do nowadays, so we don't really have a use for these ear muscles anymore. All right, and then finally, our fourth type of evidence for evolution, biochemistry. Now this one was not around back in the day when Darwin was coming up with his theory of natural selection. This came when we were able to start getting into sequencing the genomes of organisms, figuring out the combinations of A, T, C's, and G's, and comparing them. So you have 4 different organisms here. You have humans, chimpanzee, gorilla, and orangutan. We are very closely related to chimpanzees. We share, they say, about 98% of our genetic code with them. And you can see from these strips of DNA, I know there's no A, T, C's, and G's here, but you can see how closely related the pattern is in our genetic code and their genetic code. The only difference being this band right here that we have that they don't, and then the gorilla and the orangutan. So you can use DNA, or the biochemistry we call it, of organisms to determine their relatedness and their common ancestry. So here's an example with a very quick or very short sequence of DNA from 4 organisms. And the first question asks, which organism is most closely related to the human? So how would you do that? You would look at each letter and count how many differences there are between each organism and the human. So go ahead and take a second to do that. Which one is most closely related? So I think you should get the cat for that one. I believe the cat has 2 differences in its DNA and the dog has 3. And then which organism is least closely related? Of course, the bird. They have the most differences in their genetic code compared to the human. And you can use this information in your DNA, or what they do now is they take this information, they take the genome of an organism or its genetic code, and they compile it into what they call a phylogenetic tree. Kind of looks like a March Madness bracket. Too soon? Sorry. But they compare the relatedness of organisms based off of their DNA or the traits that they have, and they group them on this sort of like an evolutionary tree. So they'll group them based on, sometimes you'll see all the mammals together. In this case, there's only 1 mammal on the tree. But you can see as you go through, each point where it branches off is where they believe a common ancestor of these organisms would have been. Now, we don't know what the common ancestor is. We haven't discovered it yet. We're not sure, but that's where we think that they would have broken off and from a common ancestor diverged into 2 different species or their own separate species. Next week, we're going to talk about how a species evolves and how we get new species. Sometimes on a phylogenetic tree, you see traits or where the organisms would have acquired those traits. And what this means is every organism that falls after the tick mark has that trait. So 4 walking legs, salamander, turtle, and leopard all have that trait, whereas the tuna, lamprey, and lancelet do not. Same thing down here. The leopard is the only one that has hair on its body. None of these other organisms do. So that's a phylogenetic tree, or showing the evolutionary relationships of organisms. And this is usually, again, being done by compiling the genetic information about these organisms, kind of like what we just did by looking at, which one was most closely related to the human, which one was least closely related to the human, and using that genetic information then to compile these organisms onto a phylogenetic tree. So, in terms of how do you read them and how do you practice reading them, this is something that we do a lot in AP Bio, so just a little bit of practice here today. The phylogenetic tree above shows the relatedness of 7 animals. Which 2 animals are the least closely related? What do you think for that one? You should say hagfish and chimp, right? They have the most differences in between them in terms of traits. The chimp has all of these traits except for feathers, because only the pigeon has feathers. The hagfish doesn't have any of those traits. Which 2 are the most closely related? Sorry, I clicked that one too soon, but that would be the mouse and the chimp. The mouse and the chimp are the only ones who share all of these traits together, whereas any other organism on the phylogenetic tree, if you tried to find that same comparison, you wouldn't be able to find it. Like the salamander has lungs and jaws, but the lizard has that, plus the claws and the nails, whereas the salamander doesn't have claws and nails. So the mouse and the chimp are the most closely related. They have all of these traits, of course, except for the feathers. What does it mean when 2 species have very few differences in their DNA? What do you think that means? Very few differences. So that would mean that they are more closely related to one another. Just like, if I took your genetic code and one of your siblings and compared it, you would have more similarity in your genetic code with people who are related to you than people who are not related to you. And we talked about that when we did that chimera case study, right? We talked about how much of your DNA is similar between siblings, grandparents, cousins, all that stuff. Same idea with organisms of different species. If they are more closely related to one another, they should share some similarity in their DNA. All right, so that is it. If you are in the first half of your class, go ahead and post a question about the material in this lecture. If you're in the second half of people who post a comment, make sure you answer one of the posted questions. Let me know if you have any questions, and enjoy the rest of your day.